Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another podcast from the Priority Experience podcast. Today, I am joined by Cheyenne and George, and we are going to be talking about the play Macbeth, written by Shakespeare in 1606. Macbeth is a sad tale of tragedy and bravery. We will be discussing our opinions about certain parts of the story and the whole play in general. So the first thing we're going to be talking about today is what was the biggest contribution to Macbeth's madness. In my opinion, the biggest contribution to Macbeth's madness was hearing the witch's prophecy. Before hearing this prophecy, Macbeth was a well-respected thane and a good friend to the king, but after hearing it, his mind became contaminated with thoughts of becoming the king. This is when Macbeth began to spiral into madness, and when he began to take the dark path that would ultimately lead him to the murdering of King Duncan, Banquo, and everybody else, and became the tyrant of Scotland.
So the biggest contribution to Macbeth's madness, I feel like it was Lady Macbeth. To start off, I think Macbeth was already a bit off in his head, but what made him more crazy was Lady Macbeth, for the reason because all she did was control him. She controlled what he did and what he didn't do, and Macbeth didn't have freedom, which caused him to go crazy at the end.
Easily, the largest factor that drove Macbeth's madness was that Macbeth was unable to understand what his actions would ultimately mean for him. In other words, he failed in realizing that his actions would result in significant consequences. An example of this is when Macbeth thought killing King Duncan was a good idea. Sure, it was nice to be king and all. Only Macbeth lived a life of fear that was far worse than he lived before.
Yeah, I guess everyone is entitled for their own opinion, but just for anyone who has not read Macbeth, just a basic summary is it's about a Scottish general named Macbeth, obviously, and Macbeth is receiving these prophecies from these three witches, and the three witches say to him that one day he will become the king of Scotland. Now, with all of these, all of this ambition from the witches and how he's getting controlled by his wife, Macbeth murders King Duncan and takes the Scottish throne for himself. Without spoiling a lot, Macbeth was not a very good king. It was for many reasons, like for example his wife's influence on him, and like I said before, like what she made him do and didn't do. But the question arises for you guys, would Macbeth have been a good king if it wasn't for all the circumstances? But I personally believe that he would still be a terrible king, because let's say his wife didn't force him to or control him to kill King Duncan. I feel like his ego was already really high, and one day or another he would have killed King Duncan by himself. What do you think about that, George?
I believe 100% that Macbeth would have been a great king if it wasn't for all the circumstances that came across him. The most obvious reason Macbeth was a ruthless king was all because of the witch's prophecy to him. Macbeth believed that he was destined to be king, and made poor decisions based on the prophecy, such as trying to kill Florence. I myself do not believe in fate, and think it is just a bunch of baloney. I think that anyone can choose their own destiny, and therefore, if Macbeth never learned of the witch's prophecy, he never would have killed Duncan, or dreamed of being the king of Scotland himself. Macbeth was a great man before he learned of the witch's prophecy, and I think he would have also been a great king if it wasn't for all the circumstances he went through.
Personally, I do not think that Macbeth would have made a good king even without hearing the prophecy. In the play, when Macbeth was king, he was very power-hungry, and the longer he remained king, the more greedy and evil he became. I think that this would not change even if he became king without hearing the prophecy.
I personally think Banquo would have made the perfect king for Scotland. His humble nature and nobleness make him more suitable than either Macbeth, Malcolm, or Macduff, who all possessed many qualities that were unworthy of a king, such as lust, pride, violence, revenge, and more.
Yeah, I could see why you think Banquo would be a good leader, but honestly, I feel like Macduff would be a lot better because of this one point that I have. Macbeth's characteristics include being brave, having courage, but on the same end, Peace has betrayal and murder on his back. On the other end, Macduff, he proves himself to be brave, he's honest, he's faithful, and so is his family and his surroundings. And I don't know, for that reason, I feel like he would be an excellent king and a lot better than Macbeth. What do you think about that, Devin?
I believe that Banquo would have made a better king than Macbeth. Banquo always seemed to be the more reasonable of the two of them. After hearing the prophecy that his descendants would become kings at the beginning of the play, he wasn't driven into madness like Macbeth was. Instead, he was more concerned about whether the witches were telling the truth or not.
I personally would recommend Macbeth to an audience of over 12 years old. There is quite a lot of blood and violence in Macbeth that may be taken in the wrong manner by people under 12. They may believe that violence is how you should solve your problems, when this is in fact the complete opposite. You also need a vast amount of knowledge and understanding of reality to be able to comprehend the tremendous amount of stress and pain that certain characters feel, such as Macbeth. This is extremely required because if the reader is not able to comprehend the characters' feelings and emotions, then they will definitely not be able to understand their actions or why they do specific things in the story, and will find absolutely no value in this book and think that the story is pointless.
I think that the age group for Macbeth is about 13 and up. First of all, there was lots of blood and violence in the play, but I also think that if somebody younger than 13 read Macbeth, they would miss a lot of the symbolism that goes along with the book. For example, when Macbeth saw the bloody dagger right before he killed Duncan.
I feel like as early as you can start, I would say around same thing around George, like 10 to 12 or 10 to 12 would be a good range for me, because in this book it teaches you a lot of values that are important to adopt when you're growing up. For example, how Macbeth got peer pressured into killing Duncan. If he could have controlled himself, none of that would have happened, and that's something that the book teaches. It's just an example that came to mind. Another example that comes to mind is having toxic people around you, like Lady Macbeth, for example. Like having toxic people around you can affect you, and I feel like if kids start reading that and adopt that fast, we would have a better environment around us.
If I had to rate Macbeth out of 10 stars, I think I would give it an 8 out of 10. Macbeth has many important messages that are quite relatable to reality, such as pride is a man's greatest enemy, and never resorting to violence in order to achieve something you desire. I found many likable characters in Macbeth, such as Macbeth, Banquo, Macduff, and more. The plot of the story was brilliantly written, and I quickly became attached to a few of the characters in the story. However, I don't think Macbeth ended on a high note, with the main character in the story being killed. I do think it was the most reasonable approach to the ending of the story. Lastly, we never actually found out what happened to Fleance after he escaped and fled. In the story we are told that Fleance would someday be the King of Scotland, but we never actually knew if this was accurate or not in the story, which made me quite displeased, because I now feel like Fleance was a useless character in the story. Besides that, I found Macbeth an interesting and engaging story.
Out of 10 stars, I would probably rate Macbeth a 6 out of 10, particularly because it is a very old story of about 400 years old, and it hasn't aged very well. The story was also very predictable, but it did have some good moments. For example, the final battle at Macbeth's castle. I believe that the story would have been better if I saw it in a play and was able to see the special effects in front of me instead of reading them.
To rate the book out of 10, I would give it a 7 out of 10. It was for the main reason because it was a good read, interesting plot, and some life lessons that you learned while reading the book. But on the other end, why I would rate it a 7 and not like a 9 or 10 out of 10 is because at times in the book I found it quite boring, and I feel like when you're writing a book, it should be more interesting throughout the whole book, and you shouldn't be bored while reading it. But that's just my opinion.